In the last two videos, we learned how to use arrays, which are data structures that can store multiple values. Today we will learn how to do a 2D array in C++. A 2D array is an array that contains subarrays. So it is a big array that stores small arrays, just like what you're seeing here in the comment right here. So a 2D array, we can build them using the concept of rows and columns. Right here we have the first row, and this one right here is the second row. So this big array right here has two elements. Those two elements are subarrays or arrays. So this is an array and this is an array. And both of them here are an element of the big array. And so the big array have an element at index 0, which is a subarray. So in programming, we always start counting from 0. So the element of the big array at the first position is at index 0, and it is a subarray, or it is an array. And so this array, the subarray, also have elements. So this one has elements 1, 2, and 3, okay? And also we can mention that this is the first column, this is the second column, and this is the third column. And this is the first row, this is the second row. So this is what you need to know about 2D arrays. They have rows and they have columns. Now to build a 2D array, we need to define how many rows and how many columns they have. So let's go down here to the main and define a const int rows variable like this. And let's say I want to have 2 rows. Again, I'm going to define also a columns variable. So const int columns, and I will have 3 columns. So this array right here has 2 columns, 2 rows, and has 3 columns, 1, 2, and 3. Okay? Now to define a 2D array, we need to write first of all the type of the array, which is going to be an integer in our case. Next, let's say I'll name it array like this. And if I mention only one square bracket, that means I want a normal array, right? The normal array that we usually build. But if I want a 2D array, I need to add another square bracket like this. Now this is a 2D array, but we need to make sure we mention the size. The first square bracket should have the number of rows. So we will mention the rows variable. And the other square bracket must have the number of columns, like this. So right now we just created our own 2D array, our empty 2D array. Now in order to assign some values to it, you can just hard code these values. And now how many values you can put inside this array, inside this 2D array? Well, basically we have 2 rows and 3 columns. If we multiply rows with columns, we will get 6. So the total of elements we can put in this 2D array is 6. So I'll write 1, 2, 3, 4, like this. 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is the maximum element we can hold in this 2D array. But how are these elements positioned inside the array? The first row will start by filling 3 elements, because the first row can fill 3 elements, because there's only 3 columns. Once that is done, we will go to the second row and fill it with the elements. Now, if we mention only, for example, let's say I'll mention 4 elements like this, what will happen is that C++ will automatically fill the other elements, or the missing positions if you want, so 5 and 6 in our case. So what will happen is that either C++ will fill them with zeros, or it will put some garbage value, okay? And so this is how you can assign values to a 2D array. Now we could use something called indexing. So instead of hard coding these values like this, we could use a concept of indexing. We know that with a normal array like this, I will write int array like this, for example. Let me give it a size of 2, so it could have only 2 elements like this, right? And so we know that if we say something like array, this one like this, at index 0, what this means is that I'm accessing the first element at this array. And the first element inside this array will be 1. Because array at index 0, and 1 starts at index 0, or is positioned at index 0. If I say something like 1 like this, I will be accessing 2. Now what will happen if I do this with this array, with the 2D array that we have? So let me comment this out like this, and let me go down here. If I go ahead and say array index 0, what I am doing is I'm accessing the array at this index. So because this is a array, a big array that stores subarrays, when I say array index 0, that means I'm accessing the first element at index 0, which is an array. So I'm here accessing an array. And in order to access, for example, the number 1, I need to use another time the indexing to be able to access this number. So if I say something like, again like this, array index 0 and index 0, what I'm doing here is that first of all, I'm accessing the first element of the big array, which is an array, and I am accessing again at index 0 the element inside the subarray, which is 1. And so let me go ahead and print it for you. So I will say something like this just to see the output, and let me put a semicolon right here. And so let's go ahead, compile and launch. As you can see, we get 1. So we were able to access this element right here. If I go ahead and say like this, what do you think I should get? So array index 0, the first element, which is an array, and then we mentioned 1, that means the element at index 1 of the subarray. And so the element will be 2. Okay, now what if I say something like this? What will happen now? Which element we will get? Oh, and we got 0, that's because, oh yeah, okay. So C++ by default filled them with zeros, okay? So when you don't mention a value, so C++ will automatically generate this value and just put a 0, okay? So I filled my array right now, and that right now we should get 5, okay? So let's go ahead and see it, and we got 5, okay? So last time we got 0 because we didn't mention a value at this particular index, so C++ just generated a random value, which it puts 0, okay? And so we got 5. So what this means is that we access the subarray at index 1, and we access the element at index 1 of this subarray. So now that we know how to use indexing into the arrays, we could use this concept of indexing to assign some values to this 2D array. I could say something like array index 0 equal to 1, for example, right? So what this means is that I'm assigning at array index 0, the value of 1. So array at index 0 we have the subarray, and I'm saying again index 0, that means the element at index 0 of the subarray. I'm assigning the value of 1. So we could use this notation right here to assign values at this particular index, okay? So let me go ahead and again fill this array. So I'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now, what could we do here is that we could change the value at a certain position using this notation right here. So not only we can use this notation right here to add an element on this inside this index, but we could also override the existing element at this index. So if I say something like 50 right here, I am changing 1 to 50. So let me do a before and after. So I'll say cout before like this, before, and I'll say something like array like this, index 0, so I'm accessing element 1. Let me copy this line, copy, and I'll paste it right here, and instead of before I'll write after, like this. Now if I run my code, you can see that we will get 1 before and 50 we will get it after. Now how could we use a for loop to print this array? We know that with a normal array we could use a for loop to print this normal array. But how could we do this with a 2D array? So before we do this, I want to show you how we also can pass a 2D array to a function. So let me go ahead and delete all of this right here. I'm going to create a function called void print array, and this function must take a 2D array. So I'll say int array like this, and I will mention 2 square brackets. Now the problem when you mention 2D arrays to a function, we need to directly pass them their length, or excuse me, the rows and columns that they should have. So instead of hard coding the values like this, because we have 2 rows and 3 columns, what I will do is I will delete this, and instead of having those 2 variables inside the main, what I will do is I will make them global variables. And global variables are variables that can be accessed anywhere in your code, because they don't have a local scope. If they are inside the main, they can only be accessed inside the main. Once they are outside the main or not inside any scope, they are called global variables. They could be accessed anywhere. So right now, I could mention rows like this and columns. So I am assigning, or I'm giving a parameter to this array that has 2 rows and 3 columns. A 2D array that has 2 rows and 3 columns. So this is how you can pass a 2D array to a function. And of course, not to forget, a 2D array or an array, when you pass it to a function, it is automatically called by reference, or it is passed by reference automatically. Okay, so that means the compiler will directly go to the memory and affect the original array inside memory. It won't create a copy of this array. It's not a pass by value. Okay, if you want, you can visit this video about pass by value and pass by reference to know what's the difference. Now let's go ahead and print this array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a for loop. The first for loop will start at I equals 0, and first of all, when you want to print a 2D array, you should start with the row, then with the columns. So let's say like this: for int I equal to 0, I less than rows, I plus plus. like this. We start with the first row, which is at index 0. Once we start with the first row, we go to the columns. So that is why what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a nested for loop. I will say for int j, for example, equal to 0, j less than columns, and j plus plus like this. After this, I'm going to say cout, and I'm going to say, for example, array index I, index j. I'll explain later. And so I'll mention a space like this and an end line right here. And let's go ahead first of all and print this array just to see what will happen. I'll say print array, and I'll say array like this. I'll pass our array like this. And let's go ahead and see what will happen. As you can see, we will get our array 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So what's happening exactly is that we first start with the first row. So for I at index, or excuse me, for int I equal to 0, we start with I equal to 0. Then we go to this nested for loop, the inner for loop. It will start with j equal to 0 and less than columns, as long as j is less than columns. What will happen is that we will cout array index I, index j. At first, I and j will be equal to 0. So this is same as saying array index 0, index 0 also. So this is accessing the element 1 right here. So subarray index 0 and element at the subarray at index 0, like this. Then j will be incremented. It will become 1. Then it will become 2. And then the condition will evaluate false because j will become equal to the columns. So the condition will stop right here, and array index 0, index 2 is the element 3 right here. Once this is done, that means we are done reading the first row. What will happen is that I will be incremented by 0, or excuse me, by 1. So what we'll get is I equal to 1, and we'll restart the inner for loop, and it will become like this. So array index 1, index 0, it will be 4. And this will continue until we finish all the rows and all the columns. So this is how you can print a 2D array. You start with the first row, which is at index 0, you print all its elements, then you jump to the next row. Now let's go ahead and do this exercise. We should create a function called fillArray that allows the user to input values and add these values into the matrix or the 2D array, we could call it this way. And this matrix or 2D array should have 2 rows and 3 columns. Okay, that's simple. We have the rows variable, we have assigned to it the value of 2, and we have the columns variable that has the value of 3. Let's go ahead right here and create a function called void fillArray like this, and let's pass it our array like this, and it should be a 2D array. And so I will mention rows right here and columns. And so rows and columns are 2 global variables. Okay, now let's go ahead, and how do we loop inside a 2D array? We need to use 2 for loops, a outer for loop and an inner for loop. So for int I equal to 0, this first for loop should be to iterate onto the rows. So always the first for loop will be to the rows, and the second for loop will be for the columns. So like this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for int I equal to 0, or excuse me, j, let's say like this, j less than columns, and we should say now j plus plus. What I'm going to say to the user is I'm going to tell the user at which position they will implement, or excuse me, add this element. So I will say something like row, like this, row I, and column j, like this. Okay, so the user will know at which position they will insert this element. And so to accept input from the user, we need to use the cin, like this. And once we accept input from the user, I want to assign it to the correct position. So index I, index j, like this. So first of all, let's go ahead into the main before explaining. Let's go ahead and create an int array, a 2D array, and it will have rows like this, 2 rows, 3 columns like this. Now let us go ahead first of all and fill the array. So fillArray like this. I will pass it the array, and then once we do this, we will print the array like this. Okay, let's go ahead and see what we will get. So I will compile and then launch like this. So at row 0, column 0, what do I want to insert? Let's insert 12. I want to insert right now at 0, column 1, 13. Then let's go ahead, insert 14. Now we are at the second row, the row at index 1. What I want to insert, let's say 15. So we are still at the second row, or row at index 1, or subarray at index 1. And now I want to add the number 16, and now the last number, which will be 17, and this is our 2D array or the matrix that we built right now. And so right here, because I and j are always changing, that means we will add the elements always at different positions. First of all, we start with I equal to 0, then we jump to j. Then what we will do is we will get input from the user and store this input inside the appropriate index. So this means we filled 12. Next, j will be incremented and it will become array index 0, index 1. This is where we filled 13. Then j will be incremented again, index 0, index 2. This is where 14 will be filled, so row 0, column 2. Once this is done, good, we will go to the second row or row at index 1. And what we will fill, row index 1, index 0, we will fill 15, and so on. You now get the idea, and this is how you could use a 2D array and how to iterate through the array using two for loops, a outer for loop and an inner for loop. And this is it about 2D arrays. Make sure to watch the last two videos about arrays to refresh your knowledge about arrays. Now I thank you for watching today's lesson, and make sure to subscribe to stay up to date with the next C++ tutorial. So I hope to see you in the next video.